The night I almost died, my husband held my hair back while I vomited into the kitchen sink, and he told me I was being dramatic. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the ambulance. Not the ICU. That moment, at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, when I was on my knees on our kitchen floor with my whole body shaking like a plucked wire, and Marcus stood over me with his arms crossed and said, "Anh, you do this every time you're stressed. You need to see someone. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters." He wasn't panicking. He wasn't calling 911. He was managing me. Like I was an inconvenience that had chosen the worst possible night to happen to him. My name is Anh Tran. I'm 44 years old, and for the last 16 years, I have worked as a clinical pharmacist, the last 9 of them in the oncology unit of a mid-sized hospital outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I spend my days calculating exact milligrams of chemotherapy drugs down to fractions of a decimal point, because a rounding error in my job doesn't just cost money. It costs a person their remaining months with their children. I know more about how the human body absorbs, metabolizes, and rejects foreign substances than almost anyone you will ever sit next to at a dinner party. Which is exactly why, 3 weeks before that night on the kitchen floor, I had started keeping a private log on my phone of every single time I felt wrong. Not sick, wrong. There's a difference, and if you've never worked in medicine, you might not know it, but your body knows it. Sick is a virus, a stomach bug, food that didn't agree with you. Wrong is your heart doing something it has never done before. Wrong is your hands going numb in a pattern that doesn't match any diagnosis your own doctor can explain. Wrong is waking up at 3 in the morning with your mouth full of the taste of bitter almonds and lying there in the dark next to the man you married 15 years ago, wondering, for the very first time in your marriage, if the thought forming in your mind is insane, or if it's the only sane thought you've had in months. I need to back up, though, because you won't understand how far I had to travel to let myself think that thought unless you understand what I thought I had. 15 years ago, I married Marcus Ferris in a courtyard behind my parents' restaurant in Greensboro, under strings of paper lanterns my mother had sewn herself, and my best friend in the entire world stood beside me in a pale green dress, crying harder than I was. Her name was Sabrina Holt. We'd met at 19, 2 broke college kids splitting a 1-bedroom apartment and a single working hairdryer. And by the time I walked down that makeshift aisle, she wasn't my friend anymore. She was my sister. She was the person who sat with me in a hospital waiting room when my father had his first heart attack. She was the person who flew to Chicago on 4 hours' notice when I called her crying after my first miscarriage, before I'd even told Marcus. She was the maid of honor who stood up at my wedding and said, in front of 140 people, "I have known Anh longer than anyone in this room except her parents, and I promise you, Marcus, you are the luckiest man alive." 15 years of birthdays. 15 years of Thanksgivings, because her own family was scattered across 3 states, and mine had more chairs than we knew what to do with. 15 years of 2 a.m. phone calls when her marriage to her first husband fell apart, and later, when mine hit its own quiet rough patches, the kind every long marriage hits. She was there for my son's birth. She held him in the recovery room before Marcus's own mother got to the hospital. So when I tell you that this is a story about my husband trying to poison me to be with her, I need you to understand that I am not describing a stranger. I am describing the 2 people I trusted most completely in this world, and the particular, specific horror of discovering that the architecture of your entire adult life was built over a room you never knew existed. But let's go back to the almonds, because that's where the real story starts. The night I stopped being a wife who was simply having a hard year and became a woman running a covert investigation into her own murder. It was February. We'd been married 14 years and 10 months. Our son, Elias, was 12, deep in that stretch of middle school where he needed us less and noticed everything more, which would matter later, more than I could have guessed. Marcus worked in commercial real estate, the kind of job that came with client dinners and networking obligations that had crept, over the past year, from once a month to nearly every week. I hadn't thought much of it. Real estate had gotten harder since the rate hikes. I assumed he was hustling. I'd started feeling strange in December. Nothing dramatic. A persistent low-grade nausea most evenings. A headache that lived behind my right eye like a tenant who'd stopped paying rent but wouldn't leave. A fatigue so total that some nights I fell asleep mid-sentence reading to Elias. The kind of exhaustion that made my own coworkers start gently asking if I was getting enough iron. My primary care doctor ran the standard panel. Everything came back unremarkable. She suggested I might be depressed, might be perimenopausal, might want to see someone about the headaches if they persisted. I want to be honest with you. For a long time, I believed her. I believed I was just tired. I believed 44 was simply when a body starts complaining. I had no reason yet to look for a villain, because the only villain I could have imagined was time itself. Then came the night with the almonds. I'd made dinner. A simple stir-fry. Nothing unusual. Ingredients I'd used 100 times before. Marcus had come home late from what he called a client dinner, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, which I noticed, and then, in the specific willful blindness that I am not proud of, decided not to notice. He said he wasn't hungry. He poured himself a glass of the good scotch, the bottle Sabrina had actually given him for his birthday 2 years earlier, and he sat with me while I ate, scrolling his phone, distracted in the particular way he'd been distracted for months. 40 minutes later, I was on the bathroom floor. It came on so fast it frightened me even before the physical symptoms did. The speed of it. One moment I was rinsing a plate, and the next my vision had gone strange at the edges, tunneling slightly, and there was a metallic, bitter taste flooding the back of my throat that had nothing to do with anything I'd eaten. My heart was slamming against my ribs in a rhythm I didn't recognize. My hands started to tingle and then go numb, starting at the fingertips and crawling toward my wrists like frost spreading across a window. And underneath all of it, unmistakable to anyone who has spent 16 years around pharmacology textbooks, the smell. Bitter almonds, faint, but there, on my own breath. I have told very few people this next part, because it sounds unbelievable even to me, and I lived it. Lying on that bathroom floor, gasping, genuinely uncertain whether I was about to die, some clinical, detached part of my brain. The part trained to notice. The part that had spent a career double-checking dosages because someone's life depended on the decimal point, was already running a differential diagnosis. Almond smell, rapid onset, tachycardia, neurological symptoms. That specific combination has a name in toxicology, and it is not a coincidence, and it is not anxiety, and it is not perimenopause. Cyanide-adjacent compounds present that way. So do certain glycosides, in high enough concentration, metabolized by the body into cyanide's chemical cousins. I did not have the luxury, on that floor, of finishing the thought. I called for Marcus. And Marcus came, and Marcus looked down at me. And Marcus, the man who had held my hand through 2 miscarriages and a mastectomy scare in 2019, crossed his arms and told me I was being dramatic. He did eventually drive me to the ER, 45 minutes after I begged him to, only after I threatened to call the ambulance myself. By the time we arrived, my heart rate had partially stabilized on its own. The way these things sometimes do once the initial exposure passes and the body starts fighting back. The ER doctor, exhausted at the end of a double shift, ran a basic cardiac workup, found nothing acutely alarming in that narrow window, and discharged me with a diagnosis of likely panic attack, rule out vasovagal episode. Marcus nodded along the entire time, agreeing with every word, his hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture that anyone watching would have called tender. In the car on the way home, he said, "See? Nothing wrong. You need to talk to someone, Anne. This stress isn't good for you." I didn't argue. I was too exhausted, too rattled, too willing, even then, to believe the version of events where I was simply broken, rather than the version where someone had done this to me on purpose. That is the particular cruelty of gaslighting from someone you love. It doesn't just ask you to distrust your own body. It asks you to distrust the one skill set you've spent your entire career trusting completely. But that night, after Marcus fell asleep, and he fell asleep fast, faster than a man should after nearly losing his wife, I lay awake in the dark, running my tongue along the inside of my mouth, tasting the fading ghost of bitter almond, and I opened the notes app on my phone under my pillow, and I typed 4 words that would become the first entry in a log that, 11 weeks later, would sit in a manila folder on a prosecutor's desk. Something is not right. I had no idea yet how right I was, or how far the wrongness reached, or that the woman I would eventually call at 2 a.m. for help piecing it together would not be Sabrina. Because Sabrina, it would turn out, already knew everything. To understand how I could live inside a lie for months without seeing it, you need to understand what our marriage actually looked like from the inside, because it did not look like a marriage in trouble. It looked, from where I stood, like a marriage that had simply matured. Marcus and I met when I was 26 at a mutual friend's housewarming party in Raleigh. He was funny in the low-key, understated way that took a few conversations to notice, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you instead of performing for a room. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers, which at 26, after a string of men who treated conversation as a cue system for talking about themselves, felt like discovering water in a desert. We dated for 2 years, got engaged at a state park where he'd hidden the ring inside a thermos of coffee because he knew I'd never suspect a thermos, and married the year after that. For the first decade, I would have told you, without hesitation, that I had built the marriage I wanted. We had Elias 4 years in, after the 2 miscarriages that Marcus grieved alongside me in a way that made me trust him more, not less. He was the one who suggested we frame the ultrasound photo from the pregnancy we lost at 14 weeks and hang it quietly in the nursery closet, somewhere private, somewhere just for us. He came to every single one of my mastectomy consultations in 2019 when a suspicious mass turned out, thank God, to be benign, and he held my hand in a waiting room so tightly I had bruises the next day. And I remember thinking, this is a man who is genuinely terrified of losing me. I tell you all of this not to make you like him. I tell you this because I need you to understand that the version of Marcus who eventually tried to end my life did not arrive as a stranger. He arrived wearing 15 years of proof. Sabrina was woven through every one of those years just as tightly. She and Marcus had become close in their own right. Of course they had. That's what happens when your best friend and your husband both love you and therefore spend a decade and a half at the same dinner tables, the same holidays, the same hospital waiting rooms. She had gone through her own divorce 4 years into my marriage, and Marcus and I had let her stay in our guest room for 6 weeks while she got back on her feet. No complaints, because that's what you do for family. And by then, she was family. I remember a night during that stretch when I came downstairs for water and found the 2 of them at the kitchen table at midnight. Sabrina crying about her ex, Marcus listening with his hand resting on top of hers on the table, and I remember feeling nothing but gratitude that my husband was capable of that kind of tenderness toward the people I loved. I have gone back to that memory more times than I can count in the months since. I have turned it over like a stone, looking for the crack that should have been visible even then. I still don't know if it was already happening, 4 years into my marriage, or if it started later. Some part of me suspects I will never know for certain, and that not knowing is its own particular wound. What I do know is the shape our friendship took over 15 years, because it never wavered in a way I could point to. Sabrina worked in medical billing at a different hospital system across town, close enough to my world that we understood each other's professional exhaustion, far enough that we never crossed paths at work. We had a standing coffee date every other Sunday morning that had survived my pregnancy, her divorce, both of our fathers' declining health, a global pandemic. She was the person I called when Elias got suspended in 6th grade for a fight I still believe wasn't his fault. She was the person who sat with me in a different waiting room, years after the mastectomy scare, when my mother had her stroke. 15 years of Sabrina Holt being unambiguously the most consistent person in my life outside my own household. So when the symptoms started in December, the fatigue, the headaches, the strange low hum of wrongness I couldn't name, Sabrina was one of the first people I told. We were at our usual coffee spot, a little place with mismatched chairs that we'd been going to since before it got popular with a younger crowd, and I remember telling her I felt like my body was betraying me, and I remember her reaching across the table and squeezing my hand and saying, "You've been under so much stress. You're allowed to fall apart a little, Anne. I've got you." I believed her completely. I had no reason not to. 15 years is a long time to build trust, and trust, once built that thoroughly, doesn't just evaporate. It has to be actively, deliberately destroyed by someone who understands exactly how much weight it can bear before it breaks, and exactly how to make the breaking look like something else entirely. I didn't know yet that the person telling me to fall apart a little was the same person quietly making sure I would. After the almond night, I did what 16 years of clinical training had taught me to do when something doesn't add up. I stopped trusting anecdote and started collecting data. I want to walk you through this carefully, because the way I built this case is, in its own way, the real engine of this story. I am not a woman who confronts. I have never been the type to throw a plate, to scream in a parking lot, to demand answers in the heat of discovery. My whole professional life has been built on the discipline of verifying before acting, because in oncology pharmacy, acting on a hunch instead of a confirmed calculation can kill someone. I applied that same discipline to my own life, and it is the only reason I am alive to tell you this story. The Notes app log became a spreadsheet within a week. Date, time, symptom onset, symptom description, what I had eaten or drunk in the preceding 2 hours, who had prepared it. I told no one I was doing this. Not my sister, not my closest coworker, and certainly not Sabrina, because some instinct I couldn't yet name told me to keep this compartmentalized, the way you'd handle any sensitive investigation. Trust nothing until it's confirmed. I didn't consciously suspect Marcus yet. I want to be honest about that. In those first 2 weeks of tracking, I thought I might be documenting evidence of an undiagnosed illness, something my doctors had missed, some rare condition I'd eventually bring to a specialist with actual data instead of vague complaints. But patterns don't lie, and the pattern that emerged over 3 weeks made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with poison. Every single episode. And there were 4 more after the almond night, each slightly less severe, as though someone were calibrating a dose. Happened on an evening when Marcus had cooked, or poured my drink, or handed me a supplement he'd started helping me remember to take back in January. A magnesium and B-complex combination he said he'd read was good for stress and fatigue, in a plain white bottle he kept in his side of the medicine cabinet instead of mine. Every single episode happened on a night I later learned. From a credit card statement, I finally worked up the nerve to actually scrutinize instead of glance past. That did not correspond to an actual client dinner. The restaurant charges were real. The clients were not. I called 2 of them myself, using a pretext about a scheduling mix-up for a follow-up meeting, and both told me, politely confused, that they hadn't seen Marcus in months. And every single episode happened within 4 days, in either direction of a lunch or coffee date with Sabrina that I hadn't attended. Dates where Marcus would casually mention, "Oh, I ran into Sabrina at the coffee place. She says hi," in a tone so light and unbothered that I never once questioned why my husband was running into my best friend at her coffee place, alone, with increasing frequency. I sat with that spreadsheet open on my laptop at 11 o'clock one night in early March, Marcus asleep upstairs, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. Not panic. The opposite of panic. The specific, terrible calm of a person who has just watched a diagnosis resolve out of a fog of ambiguous symptoms into a single, undeniable shape. I still didn't have proof of intent. A pattern of correlation is not a confession. So I did the next thing my training told me to do. I went looking for the substance itself. The plain white bottle in Marcus's side of the medicine cabinet was labeled, in his own handwriting, on magnesium/B complex. I had been taking 2 capsules most evenings for 2 months because my husband, with apparent concern for my well-being, had suggested it, and I had trusted him, the way you trust someone who has spent 15 years earning it. I did not confront him. I did not throw the bottle away. Instead, on a Thursday, when I knew he had an actual, verified late meeting, I checked. This one was real. I drove to the hospital 40 minutes early for my shift and let myself into the pharmacy lab before anyone else arrived, and I ran an informal composition check on 3 of the capsules using equipment I had every legitimate right to be standing in front of, because I told myself, and it was true, that I was simply trying to identify an unlabeled substance that had made me sick, which is a thing pharmacists are sometimes asked to do. What came back wasn't a controlled substance. It wasn't anything dramatic or cinematic. It was something almost worse in its ordinariness. A compound derived from bitter apricot kernel extract. Amygdalin, the same substance that, when metabolized by the human body, breaks down into hydrogen cyanide. Sold online, unregulated, marketed under euphemisms about natural wellness and cellular therapy, to people desperate enough to believe it, easily purchased in bulk with no prescription and very little scrutiny, because it exists in a gray area between supplement and poison that most people never think to question. In small amounts, occasional amounts, it might produce nothing more than mild nausea, a headache, fatigue that could be explained a dozen other ways. In slightly larger, carefully calibrated amounts, delivered consistently over weeks, it could produce exactly the symptom pattern I had been living through since December. A slow, deniable, escalating poisoning designed to look, to any doctor running a standard panel, like stress, like anxiety, like a woman falling apart under the ordinary weight of midlife. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 40 minutes before my shift, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to stop them, and I understood, with total clarity, that my husband had spent 2 months slowly poisoning me in our own kitchen and telling me I was being dramatic every time my body screamed about it. What I did not yet know, what I would not learn for another 9 days, in a discovery that would hurt in a way the poison never had, was who had told him what dose to use. I want to tell you about the 9 days between the lab confirmation and the moment everything else broke open, because those 9 days were the hardest of my life, harder even than the night I nearly died on the bathroom floor. Physical fear, it turns out, is almost bearable compared to the specific vertigo of sitting across the dinner table from someone you love, smiling, passing the salt, while a voice in your head is screaming that he is trying to kill you and you cannot yet let him know you know. I stopped taking the capsules immediately, of course. I flushed them and refilled the bottle with an identical over-the-counter magnesium supplement I bought myself, so the switch would go unnoticed. Within 4 days, the nausea and the headaches began, cautiously, to lift. That alone told me everything the lab report already had. But I needed more than a stopped symptom. I needed to understand the why and. God forgive me for what this cost me to learn. The who. I am not proud of what I did next, though I have stopped apologizing for it. On a Sunday afternoon, when Marcus took Elias to a baseball tournament 2 hours away, I sat down at his laptop. He'd left it open, unlocked, the way he always did, because in 15 years he'd never had a reason to think I'd look. And I went looking. I found the apricot kernel extract purchase first, an order from 4 months earlier, paid through a payment app linked to an account I didn't recognize, shipped not to our house but to a UPS store 15 minutes from Sabrina's apartment. Then I found the messages. I'm not going to reproduce every word of what I read that afternoon, because some of it doesn't belong in a story, even one as painful as this one. Some of it belongs only to the 2 people who wrote it, in the private hell they'd built together. But I will tell you the parts that mattered, because they're the parts that turned a poisoning into a betrayal so complete it required a second grief entirely, separate from the first. Sabrina had sent Marcus an article link 4 months earlier, from one of those alternative wellness forums, about natural remedies causing unexplained symptoms that mimic anxiety, useful in high-conflict situations. Underneath it, she'd written, "This is what I was telling you about, slow and steady. No one questions a woman falling apart. They just tell her to see a therapist. Trust me. I've watched Anne do this to herself over nothing for years." I read that sentence perhaps a dozen times before it fully landed. My best friend of 15 years. The woman who held my newborn son, who sat beside me through my mother's stroke, who I had trusted with every soft, unguarded part of myself, had not just known. She had researched. She had suggested. She had, in her own words, taught my husband how to hurt me in a way that would look, to every doctor and every friend, and eventually to me, like I was simply a woman coming undone under her own weight. Further down the thread, months of messages unspooled a plan I still find difficult to fully absorb even now, writing it out. They were not simply having an affair, though they were certainly having that too, in explicit detail I wish I had never read. They were planning a future that required my absence, not my departure. Marcus had mentioned, more than once, that a divorce would cost him everything. The house, a chunk of his retirement, his relationship with Elias if I fought for primary custody, which they both seemed to assume, correctly, that I would win outright given his employment travel and her lack of any legal claim to our son at all. A slow illness, though. A wife who declined mysteriously over months, who doctors couldn't quite diagnose, who eventually succumbed to something tragic and unexplained. That came with sympathy instead of scrutiny. That came with a life insurance payout instead of a custody battle. That came with a grieving widower who could, after a respectful interval, quietly build a new life with the woman who'd apparently been in love with him for years. According to one message from Sabrina I have never been able to fully unread, I've loved you since the guest room, Marcus. I just didn't know how to have you without losing everything else too. Now we don't have to choose. Since the guest room. 4 years into my marriage. The 6 weeks I let her stay in our home while she rebuilt her life. Grateful, I thought, for the family that had shown up for her. I closed the laptop and sat very still in my own kitchen. The same kitchen where I had nearly died in February. And I did not cry, not yet. I felt something colder and more useful settle into place instead. The same clinical stillness I'd felt reading the spreadsheet, except now it had a target. I was not going to fall apart. I was not going to give either of them the satisfaction of watching me become the unraveling woman they had so carefully engineered. I was going to do what I had spent 16 years training to do when the stakes were this high. I was going to build a case airtight enough that no defense attorney, no sympathetic jury, no smooth-talking husband with a decade and a half of practiced tenderness could talk their way out of it. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life, because I lived them on 2 entirely separate tracks at once. On the surface, I was a wife slowly recovering from a stress-related illness, exactly as Marcus and Sabrina had scripted. I let the improvement in my symptoms read as validation of his advice to see someone. I even started, genuinely, seeing a therapist, though not for the reasons Marcus assumed, and not to talk about the things he thought I needed to talk about. I smiled at dinner. I let him rest his hand on my shoulder. I did not change the temperature of my voice by even a degree, because I understood, with the same precision I brought to a chemotherapy dosage, that the moment they suspected, I knew. Any physical evidence still in that house would disappear within hours. Underneath that surface, I was building a file. I photographed the original supplement bottle before I swapped its contents, time-stamped and stored in a cloud folder Marcus didn't know existed, along with the lab composition results from the hospital. I requested my own complete medical records from every visit since December. The ER discharge summary, my primary care notes, the full cardiac workup from that first night, and had a toxicologist colleague I trusted completely, a woman named Priya Ose, who'd been a professional acquaintance for years and who I finally, carefully, brought into my confidence, review the symptom pattern against amygdalin, toxicity independently, without me first telling her what I suspected, so her conclusions would be untainted by my theory. Her assessment matched mine within an hour of reviewing my log. I screenshotted the messages I'd found on Marcus's laptop. Every one dated, in context, resisting the urge to only save the most damning lines, because I understood that a prosecutor would need the full arc, the slow-built intent, not just the worst sentence. I did this over 4 separate sessions, spread across weeks, never taking more than I could plausibly explain if I were somehow caught, always logging out completely afterward, always double-checking that his laptop's activity history showed nothing. I pulled the credit card statements and cross-referenced every fabricated client dinner against the actual UPS store shipping records I'd requested using the tracking number from the original order confirmation still sitting, carelessly, in an old email in an account he'd forgotten I once had access to from years earlier when we'd shared a joint subscription service. I built a timeline. I built a spreadsheet that would eventually run to 11 pages. I did all of this while making Elias's lunches, while running an oncology pharmacy floor at a hospital where other people's lives depended on my full attention, while lying next to a man every night who I now understood, with total certainty, wanted me gone. I also, and I want to be honest about how hard this part was, began quietly building a life raft for myself and my son, separate from the case entirely. I opened a bank account in my name alone at a different bank across town. I moved a portion of my own paycheck into it every 2 weeks, small enough not to be noticed against our joint account's usual fluctuation. I consulted, under a false pretext of just gathering general information, with a family law attorney named Denise Okafor, who listened to the broad strokes of my situation. I didn't yet reveal the poisoning, only the affair, testing the waters of what I could say out loud to a stranger, and who told me something I have carried with me since. The women who survive men like this are the ones who prepare before they confront. Never the other way around. The hardest night of those 3 weeks wasn't a confrontation. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Elias, my 12-year-old son, looked up from his homework at the kitchen table and asked me, apropos of nothing, "Mom, are you and Dad okay? You've been acting different." And I had to look my child in the eye and tell him I was just tired from work, because I could not yet tell him the truth, and because some part of me was still terrified that if I said it out loud to anyone who mattered, it would somehow become real in a way I couldn't take back. Even though, on my laptop, in a folder titled Tax Documents 2023 Inches so Marcus would never think to open it, it already was. By the second week of April, I had what I needed. 11 pages of financial timeline, a toxicology report, a medical record showing 5 documented episodes consistent with escalating amygdalin exposure, screenshots spanning 4 months of explicit intent, motive, and method, including the shipping records tying the purchase directly to a location near Sabrina's apartment, a second bank account, a lawyer on standby, a therapist who, once I finally told her everything in the 7th session, looked at me and said quietly, "You need to go to the police, Anne. Not just a divorce attorney. The police." She was right, and some detached, methodical part of me had known it for weeks and had simply been finishing the file before I let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to do. Because once I walked out of my house with that folder, there would be no version of my life that looked anything like it had for the past 15 years. I was not just leaving a marriage. I was ending, in the most literal and legal sense, whatever remained of the future Marcus and Sabrina had built for themselves on the assumption that I would simply, quietly, deniably disappear. I want to tell you that I moved fast enough. I want to tell you my careful, methodical case building meant I got out before it got worse. I did not, and I have made a kind of peace with that only because the alternative, that I might have moved faster and never had the evidence that ultimately protected my son and put Marcus and Sabrina exactly where they belong, is a trade I can live with, even though the 2 weeks I'm about to describe were the closest I have ever come to not surviving my own life. In the last week of April, 3 days before I'd planned to meet with the detective Denise Okafor had connected me to, a financial crimes and domestic violence specialist named Ruth Alvarez, whose name I will be grateful for until the day I die. Marcus's behavior shifted in a way that, looking back, I now understand was panic. He'd found out, I later learned, that Sabrina had grown reckless. She'd mentioned our situation, in vague but recognizable terms, to a mutual acquaintance at a work event, framing it as concern for a friend going through a rough patch, but specific enough about symptoms and timelines that the acquaintance later told me it had struck her as odd even before she knew the full story. Marcus, terrified that the slow burn plan was becoming visible before it could complete, made a decision that Ruth Alvarez would later tell me, in the flat, professional tone detectives use for the worst things they've seen, was consistent with an escalation pattern we see when a perpetrator believes discovery is imminent. He stopped being patient. On a Thursday night, he cooked dinner himself for the first time in months. A gesture so unusual that even without my spreadsheet, I would have noticed it. And with my spreadsheet, it set off every alarm I had. He'd made my favorite dish, a lemongrass chicken my own mother had taught him to make years ago, in the early, good years, and he served it with a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there in weeks, telling me he felt like we'd been distant lately and he wanted to reconnect. I sat down at that table and I understood, with a clarity that still makes my hands shake when I describe it, that I was looking at the final dose. Not a slow calibration this time. Something bigger. Something meant to finish what 4 months of small doses had started, dressed up as an act of love, on a night when Elias was sleeping over at a friend's house and there would be no witness to how quickly things went wrong. I did not eat it. I want to be clear about how hard that was. Not the resistance itself, but the performance around it. I made a show of tasting it, of complimenting the seasoning, while palming most of the chicken into a napkin under the table with a sleight of hand I'd practiced in my head a dozen times in the days since Denise's warning had made me start considering, seriously, that Marcus might not simply be poisoning me slowly, but might eventually panic into something faster. I excused myself to the bathroom twice to actually dispose of what I'd hidden. I drank exactly enough water to seem normal and no more, because water masks nothing and dilutes nothing fast enough to matter if the dose is real. And then, because Ruth Alvarez had told me 2 days earlier, in a conversation I'd taken in a hospital supply closet on my lunch break with the door locked, that if anything ever felt off before our scheduled meeting, I should call her directly and not wait, I excused myself one final time, locked myself in the bathroom, and called her. She told me to get myself and any physical evidence out of that house within the hour, under any pretext I could manage, and to bring what remained of the meal with me in a sealed container if I could do it without being seen. I told Marcus, when I came back to the table, that Elias had called from his friend's house feeling sick and I needed to go pick him up. It was a lie. But it was the only lie I have ever told in my life that I am completely at peace with, because it got me out of that house with a container of lemongrass chicken wrapped in foil at the bottom of my purse, and it got me into my car, and it got me, 40 minutes later, into an actual police station, where Detective Alvarez was waiting, along with a chain of custody evidence bag that would later confirm, through independent lab analysis, an amygdalin concentration nearly 6 times higher than anything found in my previous months of symptomatic episodes. 6 times higher. On a night when my son was, by design, not home. I did not sleep at our house again after that night. There is a version of this story where I never speak to Sabrina again, where the 15 years simply end in silence, and I move forward without ever hearing her say a word in her own defense. That is not what happened, and I've thought hard about whether to include this chapter, because reliving it costs me something every time. But I think it matters, because it's the part of the story that isn't really about poison at all. It's about the specific grief of losing a person you loved more than almost anyone, to a version of themselves you never once suspected existed. 4 days after the police station, once Detective Alvarez confirmed that the investigation had enough independent physical evidence, the lab results, the shipping records her team had subpoenaed directly, rather than relying solely on my own screenshots, my full medical history. That I was no longer at meaningful legal risk for what I'd already gathered on my own, she told me Marcus had been brought in for questioning, and that under the specific pressure of that interview, in the way these things sometimes happen, he had said Sabrina's name. I called her that night, not for closure, exactly, and not because Detective Alvarez advised it. She explicitly told me not to, warned me it could complicate things, but because some part of me, the part that had known this woman since I was 19 years old, needed to hear her voice do something other than lie to me one more time before it was over. She picked up on the second ring, and I remember her voice cracking immediately, the way it always used to when we talked about something that mattered. And for one disorienting second, my body responded to that crack the way it had for 15 years, with instinctive tenderness, with the automatic reflex to comfort her. I hated myself for that reflex more than almost anything else in this entire story. "Anne," she said, "I can explain." "You knew," I said. "You knew what he was doing to me. You told him how." There was a long silence, long enough that I almost hung up, and then she said the thing I have turned over in my mind more than any other sentence in this entire ordeal. I never thought he'd actually do it. I thought it was just talk. I don't know what I thought. I loved him, Anne. I've loved him for years, and I hated watching you two together and not understanding why it couldn't have been me. And it made me say things I didn't mean, and I am so sorry. I am so, so sorry. You told him no one questions a woman falling apart, I said. You told him you'd watched me do it to myself for years. Was any of that true, Sabrina? Was any of the last 15 years true? She didn't answer that question. Not that night, and not in any of the 4 subsequent conversations detectives would eventually require of both of us as the case moved forward, and not in the courtroom. Months later, when she took a plea deal for conspiracy rather than risk a jury hearing the full transcript of those messages read aloud. I think, in the end, she couldn't answer it, because I don't believe she knew the answer herself. I think somewhere in the last 4 years of my marriage, real love and real resentment and real desperation had braided together in her so completely that she could no longer tell where the friendship ended and the plot began. And I think that ambiguity is exactly what let her participate in something that, stated plainly, helped my best friend's husband slowly poison her to death. She would have called monstrous if she'd read it about anyone else. I have not spoken to her since that phone call. I don't intend to. But I want to say something to anyone listening who has ever wondered whether it's possible to love someone truly and still be capable of watching them suffer for your own benefit. It is possible. It happens more than any of us want to believe. The people best positioned to hurt you are never strangers. They're the ones who already know exactly where you keep your trust unguarded. The legal process took 11 months from the night in the police station to the final sentencing hearing. And if you've never lived through something like this, I want you to understand that the poisoning itself, as terrifying as it was not the hardest part of this story to survive. The hardest part was sitting in a courtroom and narrating in clinical, precise, unemotional language, because that is what the prosecution needed from me. Every single detail of how the man I had loved for 17 years had spent 5 months trying to kill me slowly enough that no one would notice, using knowledge fed to him by the woman I had trusted longer than anyone outside my own family. Detective Alvarez's investigation had corroborated everything I'd independently gathered. And then some. The shipping records tied 3 separate purchases, not one, to the UPS store near Sabrina's apartment, spanning back further than I'd realized. The first purchase had been made 7 months before the almond night, meaning Marcus had likely been experimenting with dosages on me, in small enough amounts to explain away, for 2 full months before I ever noticed anything was wrong. The forensic accountant working the case found the life insurance policy Marcus had quietly increased 14 months earlier, shortly after. The timeline made my stomach turn every time I looked at it. Sabrina's own divorce had finalized, and she had, in her own words to a mutual friend around that same time, started talking about finally getting what she deserved. Marcus's defense attorney tried, predictably, to argue that the toxicology findings were ambiguous, that amygdalin supplements are legally sold, and that intent could not be proven from purchase history alone. That argument collapsed the moment the prosecution entered the message thread into evidence. 4 months of explicit, dated, unambiguous planning, including the phrase that the lead prosecutor, a sharp, quietly furious woman named Camille Reyes, read aloud to the jury in a courtroom so silent I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Slow and steady. No one questions a woman falling apart. I testified for 2 full days. I described the bathroom floor. I described the taste of almonds. I described sitting across from my own husband at a dinner table, palming chicken into a napkin, understanding that I was fighting for my life against a man who had spent 15 years learning exactly how much I trusted him and had used every ounce of that trust as a weapon. I described telling my 12-year-old son I was just tired while building a legal case against his father in a folder labeled tax documents. I described the second call to Sabrina, the one where I finally asked her to tell me the truth and she never did. Marcus was convicted of attempted murder and 2 counts of poisoning with intent to cause serious harm and sentenced to 22 years. Sabrina, under her plea agreement for conspiracy to commit murder, received 7 years, 5 of which the judge, citing what he called a genuine, if deeply troubling, entanglement of motive that does not excuse but somewhat contextualizes the degree of premeditation, suspended in favor of probation and mandated psychiatric treatment. A decision I have made peace with only because fighting it further would have cost my son another year of a mother stuck in courtrooms instead of moving forward with him. I do not know, to this day, whether Sabrina truly believed, even for a moment, that 4 months of research into slow poisoning constituted just talk. I have stopped needing to know. Some questions you carry instead of answer. People ask me, now, almost 2 years out from that night on the kitchen floor, how I found the strength to build a case against my own husband while living inside a marriage that was actively trying to kill me. I never know quite how to answer, because the true answer isn't strength, exactly. It's training. It's the specific muscle memory of a career spent verifying before acting, checking twice before trusting a number that could cost someone their life, and understanding. Deep in my bones, long before I ever needed it for myself. That panic is the thing that gets people killed, and precision is the thing that saves them. Elias is 14 now. He knows the true version of what happened to his father, delivered in age-appropriate pieces over many long conversations with a family therapist who specializes in exactly this kind of rupture. And he has, with a resilience that humbles me daily, chosen to keep loving me fiercely and to grieve, in his own complicated way, the father he thought he had. He does not speak to Marcus. That may change someday, when he's older. And I have told him that decision will always be entirely his own to make, not mine. I sold the house 8 months ago. I couldn't stay in that kitchen. Elias and I live now in a smaller place across town, closer to my sister, with a kitchen that has never once made my chest go tight when I walk into it. And I have started, slowly, to trust food again, to trust the quiet of an ordinary Tuesday evening, to trust the particular safety of a house with no one in it who wishes me anything but well. I still work in oncology pharmacy. If anything, the job means more to me now than it did before, because I understand, in a way I never wanted to, but now carry with a kind of grim clarity, exactly how much precision matters when someone's life depends on getting the smallest details right. I think about my patients differently now. I think about the families in those waiting rooms differently now. I know, better than I ever wanted to, how thin the line is between the people who trust the wrong person and the people who survive long enough to stop trusting blindly and start trusting carefully instead. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust anyone the way I trusted Marcus and Sabrina for 15 years. I'm not sure that particular kind of trust. The unguarded, undocumented kind, the kind that doesn't keep spreadsheets, is something I'm capable of anymore. And some days that loss grieves me almost as much as the marriage itself did. But I've learned there's a version of trust that survives all of this anyway. It's quieter. It's earned in smaller increments, tested before it's given fully. It's the kind of trust I now have in myself, first and above anyone else. The trust that if my body tells me something is wrong, I will listen to it, document it, and act on it, no matter how many people stand over me telling me I'm being dramatic. The night I nearly died on my kitchen floor, my husband called me dramatic for the last time in my life. I have never, in the 2 years since, let anyone else's comfort matter more than my own survival again. If you're listening to this and some part of your body has been trying to tell you something for months that everyone around you keeps explaining away, I am asking you, as someone who very nearly didn't make it to say this out loud, keep the log. Save the receipts. Trust the data your own body is giving you, even when the people who are supposed to love you most are telling you not to. Sometimes the most dramatic thing you'll ever do is survive. If this story moved you, you are not alone, and neither was Anne. If you've ever felt like your body was trying to tell you something and everyone around you kept explaining it away, I want you to hear this. Trust yourself first. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next Second Bloom Chronicle. New stories of women who found their strength when it mattered most, every week. And before you go, tell me in the comments, at what point in this story did you know something was wrong? I read every single one.